In January of 1888, a Nebraska farmer named Thomas Whitfield woke to find frost forming on the inside walls of his own kitchen. The temperature outside had dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero, and a wind howling across the open plains had already buried half his barn under snowdrift. Thomas Whitfield was not a wealthy man, and he had no access to a furnace, no electricity, and no way to know that the storm bearing down on his farm, later remembered as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, would kill more than 200 people across the Great Plains in a single night. What kept his family warm that winter wasn't luck or money. It was a set of simple methods passed down through generations, methods that most Americans today have never even heard of. The Schoolhouse Blizzard itself remains one of the strangest weather disasters in American history because of how suddenly it struck. The morning of January 12th had actually been unusually mild for the Great Plains in winter, mild enough that many children walked to school without heavy coats. Within a few hours, the temperature collapsed by more than 30 degrees as an Arctic front swept down from Canada, catching entire communities completely unprepared. Teachers across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Minnesota were forced to decide in minutes whether to send children home into the storm or keep them trapped overnight in one-room schoolhouses with dwindling firewood. Families like the Whitfields, already isolated by miles of open prairie, had almost no warning beyond the sudden, violent drop in temperature outside their own front door. Staying warm on the frontier rarely depended on a single trick. It depended on layering several small habits together, each one ordinary on its own but life-saving in combination. The most common method involved heating bricks or smooth stones directly in the coals of a wood stove until they were almost too hot to touch, then wrapping them in cloth or an old wool sock and placing them at the foot of a bed or beside a sleeping child. A single heated brick could hold warmth for 6 to 8 hours, long enough to carry a household through the coldest stretch of the night without burning through a limited supply of firewood. It sounds almost too small a thing to matter, but in a winter where cattle froze standing upright in open fields, the difference between a warm brick and an empty hearth was often the difference between waking up and not waking up at all. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a physician practicing in rural Minnesota during the same era, documented something many historians still find unsettling. In her case notes from the late 1880s, she recorded a pattern she called the quiet deaths. Infants and elderly patients who simply did not survive the night, with no visible illness, no fever, no injury. Hypothermia, especially in small children and the elderly, can kill silently, slowing the body until it simply stops, often without the dramatic struggle people imagine when they picture freezing to death. Dr. Hayes began recommending the heated brick method to every family she visited, not as folk superstition, but as basic medical advice, because she had seen firsthand how often the line between life and death in a Minnesota farmhouse came down to whether someone had thought to warm a brick before bed. Beyond heated stones, frontier families relied heavily on the architecture of their own homes to trap warmth. Many farmhouses across the plains were built with thick sod roofs and walls, sometimes more than a foot deep, which insulated far better than the thin wooden walls people might assume. Families also slept together in a single room during the worst cold, often piling every quilt, coat, and blanket in the house onto one bed, with children placed in the middle where body heat from both sides could keep them warmest. Animals occasionally played a role too. Some families kept smaller livestock in an attached lean-to or even a section of the house itself during the harshest nights, using the animal's body heat to raise the temperature of the surrounding room by several crucial degrees. Long before the Nebraska plains were ever settled, colonial families in 17th century New England faced a different but equally brutal version of the same problem. The Puritan settlements around Massachusetts Bay endured winters that European arrivals were entirely unprepared for, far colder than anything most of them had known in England. Governor William Bradford of Plymouth Colony wrote in his own journal about settlers who froze in their beds during the first winters, before the colony had learned to build homes suited to the climate. Within a generation, colonial builders adapted by constructing massive central chimneys that ran through the middle of the house, rather than along an outer wall, allowing heat from the kitchen hearth to radiate into every room surrounding it. Families also began digging root cellars beneath their homes, which stayed several degrees warmer than the air above and doubled as a refuge during the coldest nights. That same instinct for shared, central heat reappeared centuries later, far from New England, during the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s. Farming families across Oklahoma, Kansas, and the Texas Panhandle faced a strange combination of brutal winters layered on top of years of drought and dust storms that had already stripped them of crops, income, and topsoil. With almost no money for coal and firewood increasingly scarce after years of failed harvests, many households turned to burning dried cow manure, known as cow chips, a fuel source that pioneers a half-century earlier had already relied on across the treeless plains. A farmer in the Oklahoma Panhandle named Caroline Henderson, whose letters from this period were later published and widely read, described entire winters spent feeding a stove with whatever could be found, while neighbors shared fuel and gathered in a single warm room of whichever house still had heat to offer. Dr. Eleanor Hayes's records from Minnesota were not unique in showing the cost of getting any of this wrong. County coroners in small prairie towns across Dakota Territory frequently listed cause of death simply as exposure, a clinical word that did little to capture what families actually lived through. Watching a grandparent or an infant grow quieter and colder over a single bad night with no hospital for 50 miles, and no way to call for help even if one had existed. It was this constant, quiet danger that made every inherited trick, every heated brick and shared bed and central chimney, feel less like tradition and more like simple survival. This kind of knowledge did not originate in America. Long before Thomas Whitfield's grandmother ever heated a brick on the Nebraska plains, the same basic principle was already common across rural Europe. In the cold stone farmhouses of 18th century Scotland and northern England, families used heated stones wrapped in flannel for exactly the same purpose, often called pigs because of their rounded shape. Scottish potters in Aberdeenshire even produced ceramic versions specifically designed for this use, shaped to fit comfortably against a sleeping body without burning the skin. When waves of European immigrants crossed the Atlantic in the mid-1800s, fleeing famine in Ireland and economic collapse across Germany and Scandinavia, they carried this knowledge with them, along with countless other small survival habits that never made it into history textbooks because they seemed too ordinary to write down. That knowledge began disappearing faster than most people realize. By the early 20th century, central heating systems started appearing in American homes, first among the wealthy in cities like Chicago and New York, then gradually spreading outward as coal furnaces and later gas heating became more affordable. The heated brick, once a household necessity, became something only the poorest rural families still relied on. And as electricity reached even remote farmhouses by the 1930s and 1940s, the old methods faded almost entirely. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935 under President Franklin Roosevelt, accelerated this shift dramatically. Within 15 years, the percentage of American farms with electricity jumped from roughly 10% to nearly 90%, bringing electric heaters into homes that had relied on wood stoves and warmed stones for generations. The change undeniably saved lives and improved comfort, but it also meant an entire category of inherited survival knowledge simply stopped being necessary. And knowledge that stops being necessary rarely survives being passed down for long. Within 2 generations, a set of habits that had kept families alive through some of the deadliest winters in American history was reduced to something grandmothers mentioned in passing, if they mentioned it at all. This history still matters today in ways people don't always expect. Across the country, thousands of households continue to struggle with heating their homes through the coldest months, whether because of rising energy costs, power outages, or simple poverty. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has documented a steady rise in cold-related deaths during major winter storms, particularly during prolonged power outages, like the one that struck Texas in February of 2021, when more than 200 people died, many from hypothermia inside homes that had simply gone cold. Entire families in Houston and Austin, cities rarely prepared for sustained freezing temperatures, found themselves in nearly the same position as the Whitfields had been in 1888, isolated, without heat, and without the inherited knowledge that might have helped them survive more comfortably until help arrived. Thomas Whitfield's descendants still live in Nebraska today, and when researchers interviewed his great-granddaughter for a local oral history project in the 1970s, she remembered her own mother heating bricks during power outages well into the 1950s, long after most of her neighbors had already forgotten why anyone would bother. She called it the thing Grandma always did, without ever fully understanding the desperate winter that had made it necessary in the first place. That's often how this kind of knowledge disappears, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, one generation at a time, until the reason behind the habit is gone long before the habit itself. The next time the power goes out on a freezing night, the methods that once carried entire frontier communities through the deadliest winters in American history are still sitting there, waiting, in the materials most people already have in their own homes.